Sometimes you might not really care about coming back to the original context when running the code in the continuation. Marshalling back to the original context can in some situations be considered a rather expensive operation. In those cases, wouldn't it be very handy if we were able to configure the awaiter and let the await keyword know that it doesn't have to marshal back to the original context? There's definitely a way for us to do that. Task provides a method called configureAwait. This is used to let the awaiter know if we want to come back to the captured context in the continuation. To illustrate how this works, we're going to remove all of the code in the click event handler. Then we'll introduce a new asynchronous method named getStocks4. This method will expect the stock identifier as its first parameter. It will use the stock service to call the API. After this call has completed and we've awaited the result, we'll add a note to the UI to indicate that the stocks have been loaded. As you should know by now, you can update the UI after the await keyword, because the continuation runs on the original context. Since we're going to call this method from the click event handler, we know that the continuation will execute on the UI thread. Finally, this method will return 5 of the stocks back to the caller. Let's call and await this method in the click event handler. What do you reckon happens if we configure the awaiter for the stocks loading task and indicate to the await keyword that we don't care about coming back to the original context, which would be the UI thread? ConfigureAwait allows us to specify if it should continue executing on the captured context. This defaults to true, which executes the continuation on the same thread that started the asynchronous operation. If you guessed that this would cause a problem, you absolutely guessed correct, because now we're doing cross-threading. As you see, it didn't work, and the UI was not updated. What happens here is that when we tried to update the UI, we were no longer on the original context, which means that we are no longer on the UI thread. This is rather interesting. Using configureAwait impacted what happens further down in the continuation of that method. But what happens if we move the UI interaction to the click event handler, to after the await keyword, where we are back from getStocks4? What's really interesting is that the application now works. The note was added to the application after this asynchronous operation completed. What this tells us is that using configureAwait only affects the continuation in the method that you're operating in. This means that the continuation in getStocks4 executed on a separate thread, while the continuation in search click marshaled back to the UI thread. When we are inside the search click event handler, we're in fact in a different asynchronous context. Each method marked with the async keyword will have its own asynchronous context. If you're also configuring the awaiter inside search click to not marshal back to the captured context when we're back from this getStocks4 call, we'll have the same problem as we had earlier. This is now trying to perform a cross-threading call. ConfigureAwait is extremely powerful, as it allows us to continue the execution without marshalling back to the original context. This means we could see an improvement in the performance of the application, as it doesn't have to wait for the original context to be available. This also means that in these cases, there shouldn't be anything in the code of your continuation that relies on being back on the captured context. In this case, the continuation shouldn't depend on being able to update the UI. Another important note is that thread static values from the original context won't be available in the continuation. This was a common problem in traditional ASP.NET when trying to access the HTTP context. Nowadays, that's more rare. In previous versions of ASP.NET, pretty much everyone was told to use configure-await for all their asynchronous operations. If you're working in ASP.NET Core or newer, using configure-await is totally useless. There's no such thing as going back to the captured context. ASP.NET Core no longer have what's called a synchronization context. Therefore, configure-await doesn't have an effect at all in ASP.NET Core. So if you're working in ASP.NET Core or newer, you can completely get rid of that. With that being said, when is it appropriate to use configure-await false? Whenever you build libraries. If you're a library developer, you won't necessarily know if the people that consume your libraries will be building WPF, WinForms, ASP.NET 4.8, ASP.NET Core, Xamarin, or other types of .NET applications. That's when you use configure-await false. Because in your library methods, in your continuations, you really shouldn't care about the original context. Using this inside your libraries will work the best across all different types of .NET applications. If you're building a library that exposes asynchronous methods, those probably shouldn't try and force themselves back on the original context or depend on thread static values. Be careful about using configure-await false because you really need to be able to guarantee that you don't need to access things that live on the original context when you're back in the continuation.